Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm here with a return guest, Dr. Jeff McMahan. And in our previous conversations, we've tackled topics like the ethics of killing, the ethics of killing in war. We also talked about veganism and academic freedom. And today, I thought it would be relevant due to recent events and developments in the US, but also elsewhere, that we tackle the ethics of political violence, which will also include political assassination. So, Jeff, welcome back to the show. It's always a pleasure to talk with you.
Thanks, Ricardo. Always a pleasure for me too.
Okay, so maybe before we get into the ethics itself, let's start by perhaps trying to arrive at a definition of political violence here. So, as a philosopher, and of course, I could ask the same question to political scientists and other people, but as a philosopher, what is your understanding of political violence? How do you approach it?
Well, it's a term that is being used a lot now, and what one has to do is try to understand how people are applying it. As I say, it's a sort of new term. You won't find it in a dictionary. And normally what people mean when they refer to political violence is violence by individuals or small groups of people for political reasons, or the violence that is motivated by essentially a political aim. And one of the paradigms of political violence is one that you mentioned, assassination, which is normally defined as the killing of a particularly prominent or important person for a political reason. So political assassination would come within the scope of political violence. Political violence is also sub-state violence, and it is a term that I think in ordinary use excludes war. So people wouldn't consider war political violence, even though war is almost always the use of violence by military means for the achievement of aims that are essentially political. But because it's done by the state and externally rather than internally, war wouldn't count as political violence, though violence by government agents internally or domestically could be considered political violence. So what the members of ICE are doing in the United States to people would be considered by many to be political violence. Again, it's a vague notion, partly because the notion of the political is vague, and even the notion of violence can be vague, and action that begins as political violence can end up as something that wouldn't be considered political violence. So, for example, some forms of political violence could lead to something that we might think of as revolution, and a revolution would be initially at least considered political violence, or revolutionary violence would be considered political violence, but it could develop into civil war. And once there's a civil war in progress, one wouldn't refer to the action of either side as political violence, because it would then be war. I think the notion of political violence also encompasses virtually all instances of what we think of as terrorism, which is typically defined as the intentional harming of innocent people as a means of achieving aims that are political in nature. And terrorism is not always, of course, a domestic matter. There's international terrorism. So we might think of the destruction of the Twin Towers in 9/11 in the United States as political violence. Consider the massacres of October 7th in Israel as political violence and so on.
So you mentioned Israel. How about genocide? Would you also consider that a form of political violence? I mean, notwithstanding the fact that legally genocide is considered, according to international law, a crime. But I mean, would you also consider it political violence?
Well, again, I think the notion of political violence is too vague for there to be a precise answer to that question. It's just a matter of how the term is used. Certainly, genocide can start off as political violence. I think perhaps Rwanda in the early 1990s may have started off as, one ethnic group attacking members of another for reasons of revenge and other, politically motivated reasons. But once it became kind of systematic and large scale, then I think we would want to distinguish genocide from mere political violence. Political violence, I think, is, as the term is typically used, excludes large scale and in particular state-sponsored violence.
By the way, please tell me what you think about this, but political violence doesn't necessarily have to involve humans or human life as targets, right? I mean, for example, if it's organized groups of people causing property damage to express themselves politically, that would also be considered a form of political violence, or not?
Yeah, I think so. I was thinking that usually violence is understood as physical harm to a person's body, but of course you're right. Destruction of property is also violence, yes.
Yeah.
And if the motivation is political, then it's political violence. On the other hand, when Russia destroys residential buildings in Ukraine, or Israeli forces destroy residential buildings in Gaza, we wouldn't call that political violence because it's part of war.
Okay.
It's terrorism in war, but war very often involves terrorism.
Yes, and a point that you touched on there that I think is very important: the motivations that the actors have for the violence they perpetrate are relevant in this case, right? Because they have to be political in order for their actions to be considered political violence.
Yeah.
Correct?
Yeah, it has to be politically motivated to count as political violence. Sure.
Yes, because I think that's an important point to clarify, because it will be relevant for later when we talk about political assassinations, and I want to explore a particular recent case, and I think that will be relevant there. So, but
let me interrupt you and say that this political violence is not a topic on which I have written or done any particular systematic study of, and in particular, I am not deeply informed about recent instances of political violence. I'm aware of them, but I don't know the details in any depth. So I just issue that disclaimer at the outset.
No, of course, and thank you for that. And as I said before we started the interview, I wanted to have you on the show because I also wanted to have on the show an ethical perspective on political violence, and I thought that it would link in a relevant way to your other work on the ethics of killing, for example. So that's the reason why we're having this conversation. But
Okay.
let's get then into more of the ethics of political violence. So do you think that there are instances where political violence is justified?
Yes, there are instances, but what I'm going to be arguing as we continue is that they are quite rare.
Okay.
But let's take the case of assassination. There was a plot involving some, even I believe, some German military personnel to assassinate Hitler. Um, if they had been able to carry out that plot and if they had succeeded, I think that would have been justified political assassination and therefore justified political violence. Similarly, if someone had been able to assassinate Stalin, that may well also have been something that would be morally justified. I think it's an important condition of justifiable political violence that the targets of the political violence be morally liable to be attacked.
Mhm.
And by that, I mean they must be guilty of or responsible for some threat of harm or some wrong to people of a sufficient level of gravity to justify violence. Now, um, I'm going to say something slightly technical here, and that is that by liable, I mean something like this. They have forfeited their right not to be harmed. They would not be wronged by being harmed. But I also think that certain conditions on the justifiability of violence are internal to the concept of liability. Now, there's disagreement about that among philosophers. Many others disagree with me about this. I'm not sure how much difference this makes, but what I mean is that a person is not liable to be harmed if harming that person would do no good whatsoever, or if it would be ineffective. Um, I also think that we measure proportionality by reference to weighing the good that could be achieved by causing harm against the magnitude of the harm and so on. And so I think of necessity and proportionality as constraints that are internal to liability. So someone is not liable to a harm that would be disproportionate, nor is somebody morally liable to a harm that would be ineffective or counterproductive. And what I want to say here is that in principle, people can be morally liable to be harmed, even killed for political reasons. Like I say, good examples would be Hitler and Stalin, provided that assassinating them would have prevented great harms within Europe, within the Soviet Union, rather than exacerbated those problems that were being caused by these uh, leaders, these political leaders. And what I tend to think is that in most instances nowadays, political violence and political assassination in particular are likely to be not just ineffective, but counterproductive. They're going to lead to, and this is particularly true in democratic societies, in which if a person has been elected to an office, it's a violation of the principles of democracy and so on to kill somebody who has been elected by the people. And the reaction of the people is likely to be one of great outrage and indignation, and the person killed is going to become a martyr in the eyes of the person's supporters, in which case those who succeed the assassinated leader are likely to do things that are even worse, or at least as bad as those that the leader was going to do anyway. So I tend to think that political violence at all levels is not just ineffective, but counterproductive. And for those reasons, you don't have a liability justification or any other kind of justification for doing it.
Right. And I mean, actually, there's work in sociology that supports what you're saying there, because there's a sociologist, an American sociologist, Erica Chenoweth, and she studied violent and non-violent revolutions, and the ones that are non-violent tend to last longer in time, and tend to have more support also of the general population. So they tend to lead to regimes that are more stable afterwards.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one thing that's perfectly obvious is that in conditions in which political violence is more likely, the population in which it might occur is going to be divided. It's going to be, as the people say nowadays, polarized. And violence by one side is never going to be convincing, persuasive, or whatever to people on the other side. It is going to produce a desire for vengeance, revenge, retribution. It's going to elicit hatred. So the use of political violence will very often just provoke an escalation of violence and do nothing to achieve peaceful reconciliation, compromise, enabling people to live together peacefully. It's just always going to be counterproductive in this way, self-defeating.
So I wrote here a few examples that came to my mind when I was thinking about cases of political violence that I think would be justified. And I want to hear your thoughts about it. So I wrote here slave revolts, revolutions against oppressive regimes, resisting occupation by another country. And I also included, and I can explain why I included that, in the 19th century, particularly workers fighting for their rights, like when, for example, they destroyed machinery in their factories and things like that. So, I'm just going to say about that, I think that, for example, in the case of revolutions against oppressive regimes and workers fighting for their rights in a violent form, I think it's justified when there are no legal mechanisms that they can resort to, or when the state doesn't listen to their demands because of its nature, or it might be, as I said, an oppressive regime or something like that. So what do you think about these examples that I came up with?
I think they're all different. They all raise different questions. Let me see if I can think of some considerations that might be common to all of them. You mentioned workers destroying machinery. That is different from harming people.
Yes.
You mentioned slave revolts. If slave revolts are directed against slave owners, that's one thing, because the slave owners are arguably liable to be harmed.
Yes.
Violent revolutions, they may be directed towards military forces, whatever. Similarly with resistance to occupation. But I think a lot depends on what the conditions are. Now, so slavery involved people who were dispersed over a huge area. Collective action was difficult.
Yes.
It would have been very difficult for slaves to engage in Gandhian tactics of nonviolent resistance, because they were all spread out over different plantations and so on throughout the South. So their slave revolts directed against slave owners might have been justified on the assumption that they could somehow or other appeal to the consciences of people elsewhere. On the other hand, it's not clear that the actual slave revolts that involve killing people and so on had that effect. I just don't know. I'm not a historian of slavery, so I don't know. I do think, let me give you one example that is particularly pressing right now, and that is the occupation of Gaza and the West Bank by Israel for many, many decades. The occupation of those areas by Israel, I think, is a kind of paradigm of political injustice. This was a people with a sense of their own identity, with their own culture, with their own norms and so on, who were systematically oppressed, dominated, and denied freedom and rights of self-determination. I still think every instance of violence that wasn't immediate self-defense by the Palestinians was self-defeating. I think, and I've said this for many decades, that if the Palestinians initially had been led by a Gandhi-like figure rather than Arafat and the PLO who engaged in terrorism, I think the Palestinians would have had their own state again decades ago. Because I think that's what Israel was much more vulnerable to, the appeal to conscience, especially earlier when Israeli society consisted of refugees fleeing political persecution and oppression and domination, and had come to seek safety and to have the ability to be self-determining. And if the Palestinians had made the appeal to them by saying, what about us? Don't we also have rights to freedom and self-determination and so on? I think the Israelis would have been much more receptive to that than they would have been to the use of political violence and in particular terrorism, which again, as I said earlier, simply inspires hatred and a desire for revenge. So I think, for example, this unspeakably immoral war that Israel has fought in Gaza will ultimately be self-defeating for Israel, independently of the horrible beyond description consequences for Palestinian civilians.
So since you're mentioning that, and since earlier you also referred to October 7th, let me ask you then, do you think that if on October 7th, 2023, Hamas had only targeted military, it would have been a form of justified political violence?
No, because I think it would have been, again, ineffective and self-defeating. What they did was vastly worse, vastly more immoral, and vastly more self-defeating than it would have been if they had attacked only military installations. That would have been, in a way, discriminating, but it would not have done any good. What the Palestinians need to do is to make their appeal nonviolently. That's my view. One thing that they could do would be to have mass sit-ins blocking roads to settlements, or blocking the IDF in Gaza, for example, but non-violently.
Yes, the reason why
Gandhi did.
Yes, the reason why I ask you that, I mean, actually it's two reasons. The first one is that according to international law, people who are part of a population that is occupied by another country have the right to resist, and that includes political violence if it targets only military. And also, I've heard from some people, some of them friends, others not, who are pro-Palestinian, and they tell me that they don't consider Hamas uh, what they do as a form of terrorism. Of course, legally that's not correct, but anyway, they don't consider them a terrorist group because they're, I mean, the kinds of things they do is that exactly that kind of thing that they consider to be resistance, that they consider to be justifiable justifiable resistance. So
Well, look, I think there can be very extreme circumstances in which what we call terrorism could be morally justified. That is, there could be very extreme circumstances and incredibly rare in which the intentional harming of innocent people as a means of achieving a political aim could be justified. But I think that's very rare. And what Hamas does is terrorism, pure and simple. When it fires rockets into Israel, it's trying to kill innocent people. It's trying to kill people in their homes. And that's what Hamas did on October 7th. I think myself, everything that Hamas does is unjustifiable morally. It's not only totally immoral in the effects that it has on the targets, who are almost always innocent people, innocent in the sense that they are not liable to be harmed or killed. They haven't done anything to justify this, but also because what they do is totally ineffective. Are the Palestinians in Gaza better off now for what Hamas did on October 7th?
No.
Hamas could predict that. They could know that. Every conflict between Hamas and Israel since Hamas came to power has taken the following form. Hamas shoots some rockets into Israel, or some Hamas militants get into Israel through the tunnels and innocent people are harmed or killed. And then Israel sends tanks and planes into Gaza and kills far more innocent Palestinians than Hamas was able to kill. And so they can predict that what they do is going to cause far more suffering among their own people than among Israelis. But also, it never does any good at all, except, the only thing it does is makes Israelis think Palestinians can never be trusted. They're all terrorists. I can't tell you how many times I've heard that kind of view expressed in Israel. And it's because of what Hamas and before that the PLO did. And again, another reason why violence by Palestinians has been self-defeating is that Israel has depended, particularly earlier, but even now, has depended very heavily on the United States for economic and military support in the form of bombs and that sort of thing. And it's been easier for Israel to get this from the United States because people in the United States think of Palestinians as terrorists rather than as victims of injustice. And that's because what people in the US read about are, the instances of violence by the Palestinian groups against Israeli civilians. So again, I think it's just totally counterproductive in every way, in addition to being immoral because the targets are not liable.
Okay, so
on the other hand, you spoke of people being pro-Palestinian. I mean, what I wish is that people would stop thinking of themselves as essentially Palestinian or essentially Israeli Jew, everybody waving their flags and being opposed to members of the other group. What they need is for all of them to recognize that they are human beings, that for the most part, they want the same things in life. They want to live in peace. They want their children to grow up healthy and get an education and prosper, things that people everywhere want. Maybe some Hamas militants are different in that respect. No doubt the members of the current Israeli government are different in that respect. But most people can learn to live with each other in peace without this dreadful kind of in-group, out-group hatred on both sides. So I'm supportive of those groups that try to bring communities and peoples together. I'll just put in a plug for Parents Circle, which is a group of bereaved Israelis and bereaved Palestinians who've come together to try to show what I have just said. We're all people, and let's not kill each other's children.
Okay, so maybe you also would like to comment on the final example I gave about workers in the 19th century destroying machinery because, I mean, they were being exploited in that particular case by people who owned factories and stuff like that. So what do you think about that as a form of political violence?
Probably justifiable. Again, it's just destruction of property. And when one reads about the conditions in which people labored in the 19th century, I know mostly about England, where I live. The conditions were horrific.
Yes.
These people, and involving small children as well, and people being maimed and killed in this machinery. And the conditions were appalling. What the industrialists were doing was highly immoral, just like what a lot of billionaires today are doing is highly immoral. And the destruction of machinery would be a way of communicating to these people the anger, getting them to pay attention. You have to make them pay attention. Would these industrialists have responded to later forms of industrial action like strikes and sit-in strikes and that sort of thing? Who knows? They may have just been able to call in the military and get everybody dispersed, and people elsewhere wouldn't even know about it. So the possibilities for the effectiveness of nonviolent action have developed greatly since the 19th century with mass communication and so on. And when newspapers can report these things and photographers can be there to take pictures or videos of people beating up nonviolent protesters and so on, that enables nonviolent action to be much more effective because it makes the moral appeal public.
Yes.
And that was probably not possible to workers in industrial societies in the 19th century. So they had to do something else. And I do think, destruction of machinery is far more likely to be justified than harming persons.
Yes, and also because we have to keep in mind, and I think that I mentioned this or at least alluded to it when presenting the example, when I said that they didn't, back in early industrialization, they didn't really have much legal resources, and so strikes were not even something that was protected legally. And so, I mean, they didn't have many non-violent resources to express their frustration against the exploitation they were victims of, right?
Yeah, I mean, there were forms of public protest that were possible, large gatherings of people and so on, of the sort that still go on, that went on the other day in the U.S. with the No Kings protests. But it's difficult for workers in a particular town to organize this kind of thing. or to get it publicized. I mean, there were in the 19th century rallies by suffragettes and people in favor of expansion of the franchise to non-property owners and to women and so on. And these forms of appeal were generally nonviolent, and eventually they became successful.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So let me ask you now about political assassination specifically, which I think, and as I mentioned earlier, I think is the aspect or one of the forms of political violence that perhaps links more relevantly to the rest of your work because it involves taking the life of someone or several people. So, since you wrote, as I said, the book on the ethics of killing and the ethics of killing in war, do you have anything to say specifically about political assassinations? Do you think that sometimes they might be justified?
As I said earlier, I think the justification would need to include the justified claim that the victim of assassination would not be wronged by being killed. That would be because this person continues to pose a threat of unjustified harm to other people. And of course, political leaders can pose threats of unjustifiable harm to vast numbers of innocent people, as we see today. And Putin in Ukraine, and Netanyahu and his coterie in Gaza, and the Trump administration in the United States, causing vast harm to persons and institutions there. Two points I think are important here. In most cases, as I said earlier, I think political assassination is unlikely to be effective in achieving the aim of eliminating the wrongdoing. And that's because the leader will be replaced by somebody equally bad, and political change will not occur. What will occur will be revenge against the people who were in any way associated with the assassin or assassins. I'm forgetting now what the other consideration was, but so the likely ineffectiveness is an important consideration. Gosh, I'm just forgetting what the other thought was. I mean, if the person is morally liable to be harmed or killed, then the assassination would not be murder. Murder is the killing of an innocent person. And very often political assassination is against somebody who is guilty of great wrongdoing, though the instances of political assassination that occur to me just offhand, the successful ones, particularly in the United States, so John F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King, Robert Kennedy, these were not wrongdoers. These were not people who were morally liable to be killed. Nothing good was achieved by any of this. And oh yeah, that's the other thing I wanted to say, and that is that it's important legally and also morally to uphold a principled objection to assassination, because it's so often likely to be used against the wrong people. So if somebody says, oh yeah, political assassination can be morally justified, and lots of people come to believe that, then the consequences are likely to be dreadful. So we want to uphold a norm against assassination. for that reason, if for no other. And again, I think that coincides with my claim that normally there are far better ways of removing from power some evil or tyrannical figure than assassination.
So
In
let
part,
me ask you.
okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
let me ask you, because earlier you mentioned Stalin, if someone had killed Stalin. So let me ask you, for example, when we're talking about people who are the leaders of oppressive regimes like Stalin was, like Hitler was, like Mussolini was, I've heard from some philosophers that uh, people, in this case, we're talking about political figures, but it could be on any other person, people who act immorally, like they did toward other people. One of the reasons why it might be justifiable to kill them is that their life is worth less than the life of other people, that because they are immoral their life is worth less. I mean, what do you think about that kind of argument?
I think it's I'm trying to be polite here, but I don't think I can be. I think it's a silly argument. Suppose someone's life is worth less. That's not a reason to kill that individual. You might say these people deserve it. You might say, as a philosopher I know in Cambridge has said, that sometimes it's better if such evil individuals don't coexist with us on the planet, that we have a better state of the world if it's not blighted by the existence of these awful people. These might be positive reasons for getting rid of somebody. I don't myself think they are. I think, as I said, the justification that would be really the only realistic and feasible justification for assassination would be a liability justification, namely that a person a prominent person in a position of power is engaged in wrongdoing, threatens unjustifiable harm to other people, and eliminating this person through assassination would be the most effective means of defending the potential victims of this prominent person. In that case, political assassination or assassination could be morally justified. But I think the justification would have to be a liability justification. And I think that the idea, I mean, you see this in the media now, people saying we have to, it's really important to achieve justice in the Middle East by making sure that Netanyahu is punished and so on. Yes, I think in a way it's important that Netanyahu should be punished, but only as a means of preventing him from engaging in further wrongdoing, and only as a means of preventing his action from providing inspiration to others. If we punish people like Netanyahu, we may deter others like him in the future. We shouldn't punish him because he deserves it, though he's, in my view, about as evil as any human being could ever possibly be.
Yeah, I understand that distinction, and I think it's important to make it so. I mean, just putting aside using that kind of argument to justify political violence or not, just putting that bit aside, do you agree, as a moral philosopher, that people who practice immoral acts, people who are immoral, their lives are worth less than the lives of people who are moral?
I don't know. The problem is I don't know what that means. How much is my life worth? What is it? Is this some sort of monetary value or what? I mean, Do we want there to be evil people on the planet? No. It would be better if people were good and nice and so on, but worth less. Well, let me put it this way. If I see some 90-year-old person about to drown, this person's only got another year or so of life left to live, but perfectly harmless person. And also in the water, there's Donald Trump, who's about to drown, and I can save only one of them. I'm going to save the very elderly non-Donald Trump person. So in that sense, yeah, I mean, I wouldn't, would I even spend 10p to save Donald Trump's life? No. So in that sense, it's worth less. But that's because, for the reasons I've given, the world would be a much better place without Donald Trump in it.
Yeah, I mean, the reason why I asked you that is that because one time I was having, not for the channel, but in another context, I was having a discussion with a philosopher as well, because I was saying that the lives of all people are worth the same. I mean, the life of, for example, a billionaire is worth the same as the life of a common worker. I mean, something like that. And then it was when the person said, oh, no, that's not true, because the life of immoral people is worth less than the life of moral people. And then they mentioned Hitler, for example, and said, oh, the life of Hitler was worth less than the life of the average German. And I mean, I find it really hard to understand that argument, honestly.
Well, like I say, it's just there are different ways of interpreting such a claim. Worth less. What does that mean? And some of the ways of interpreting that claim are probably plausible. So again, if I could save the life of Hitler or save the life of some ordinary German, I would save the life of the ordinary German. And part of the reason for that would be what each of these people was likely to do. Another reason would be how good is that individual's life for that person. So for example, again, just take the life of somebody whose life is full of suffering and misery, and they often contemplate suicide, and they go on living just for the sake of others, and so on. And there's nothing that can be done to make that person's life better. It's just an intrinsically miserable life. There's nothing evil about this person, but the person's life is miserable. And then there's another person whose life is very well worth living. This person is flourishing and happy, and so on and so forth. Again, if I could save one or the other of them, I think I have a reason to save the person whose life would be better, rather than to save the life of the person whose life would be much, much less good and barely good at all, or maybe not good at all. And what I think about Hitler, for example, is that his was not a life that was worth living for a human being. He had a life that was terrible for him. Even if he thought he was happy and so on, this was still, in my view, a bad life for a human being, completely independently of the effects his action had on other people. And the way I always try to bring that out is I ask people, I give people the following sort of thought experiment. Suppose you're a parent of a child and you get a phone call from the school and it says, we've had a incident here today. A child was badly beaten up by a bully. And then the person who's saying this says, oh, excuse me a moment, and then goes off the phone for a minute, and the parent on the phone doesn't know whether her child is the bully or the victim. And I think most of us would want our child to be the victim rather than the bully. And that's the victim has been harmed, but we want our children we would rather our children have less happiness and not be immoral than
Yeah.
be in one way happier, but be immoral for their own sake, for their own good. And so that's another way in which Hitler's life was worth less. It was a terrible life for a human being. So we can go on and on and on. We can say that Hitler was liable to be killed. Some people would say, many people would say he deserved to die, and so on and so forth. There are lots of ways of interpreting this claim that his life was worth less. But it's important, I think, to try to clarify
Yeah.
which of these different interpretations we have in mind.
Right. So let's talk more about the motives of people who assassinate other people. I mean, as you said earlier, for it to count as a form of political violence or a political assassination, the motives of the killer have to be political. And I find this very interesting because, I mean, one thing that happened recently, and it was in fact one of the cases that motivated me to invite you on the show to talk about the ethics of political violence and political assassinations more specifically, was the case of the assassination of Charlie Kirk in the US. Why? Because, I mean, at this point in time, it's still not clear whether it was a political assassination or not. Why? Because we're not sure about the political motivations of the killer. I mean, it seems that he didn't have any form of coherent political belief system or something like that. And then there are contradictory sort of evidence, like, for example, the fact that he inscribed in his casings things like Bella Ciao, which is an anti-fascist song. But on the other hand, the police, the authorities spoke with his roommate and with the friends that he spoke with via Discord on the internet, and they were all surprised that he had done such a thing, because with them he never spoke of politics. So, I mean, it's all over the place. At this point in time, we're not sure if he had really political motivations to do what he did or not. And in its aftermath, even though we were not sure of his motives, there were people, right-wingers in America, and Donald Trump himself, who immediately blamed the radical left. And there were conspiracy theories on the internet about, it was a radical trans group that, that was behind the assassination. And then there were, I mean, things that it is legitimate to call political persecution. Because, for example, on Twitter, and I think this was really horrible, people tried to dox people who were just criticizing Charlie Kirk's views, or, for example, celebrating, and I also have a question specifically about that, celebrating his death. And there were a few people who lost their jobs because of it. And I mean, now there's this sort of discourse of going after groups that are politicized and that are on the radical left in America in the aftermath of the assassination. So, I mean, what do you think about all of that? Because, I mean, on the one hand, I would think myself that if at this point we're not sure if the killer had political motives, we can't really say that it was a political assassination. That's the first thing. Even though Charlie Kirk was a political figure, he was a political activist, and so on. And on the other hand, I think that it's been immoral, the sort of response that we've seen from the Trump administration in response to something we're not even sure was a political assassination. So what is your opinion on that?
Well, what you have just said supports my earlier claim that assassinations are normally and are usually predictably totally counterproductive. Anybody should have known this. That is to say, if anybody did want to promote some kind of left-wing agenda, assassinating Charlie Kirk was about the most self-defeating way they could have gone about promoting that agenda. It was totally predictable that the Trump administration would react the way that it has, that businesses and so on would defer to Trump by punishing those people who afterwards were critical of Charlie Kirk, and so on. So, and again, I would stress that Charlie Kirk, I didn't even really know who he was. I mean, I live in England, and I do get a lot of literature about right-wing activity in the United States, but I had never really heard of him because I'm not that attentive. He certainly had not done anything to make him liable to be killed. He was simply going around giving talks defending certain views. If you disagree with those views, you challenge the views. You don't kill the person who is promoting those views. I mean, again, it was intrinsically immoral act and a totally self-defeating one if it was politically motivated. And I suspect that it had some political motivation. It wasn't just arbitrary. He didn't just pick somebody. You know, he didn't pick somebody whose views he thought were really admirable. That wouldn't make any sense. I mean, unless the guy is just totally deranged. But again, there's no reason to think that, particularly if he inscribed things on his bullets, as these people tend to do nowadays, which is just yeah, again, would never occur to anybody in the Trump administration to think that this kind of thing might suggest that it would be a good idea to have much more restriction on people's access to guns in that lunatic society where all the right-wingers at least are armed to the teeth. Yeah. You know, they're the ones who are going on about political violence, and well, everybody goes on about political violence, but you'd have thought that some of them might say something about trying to deprive people like this assassin of guns, but that would never occur to people there. But yeah, your general point is that we don't know whether this was a political assassination, but it's automatically treated as one, and I would say exploited as one by Trump and Vance and the other members of the administration and other people on the right in the United States. They exploiting this to further polarize the society, to inflame hatreds against people on the left and so on. And again, I think it's certainly unwise, and I think also inappropriate for people to rejoice in the murder of Charlie Kirk. And this was an assassination. It was a murder. I mean, if the person is not liable to be killed, it's legally and morally murder. And so this was clearly an instance of murder. To celebrate a murder is wrong.
But let me ask you,
criticize the views of the person is perfectly appropriate, and people are being punished for that.
But do you think that celebrating a murder is wrong? I mean, is it just simply breaking a social norm, or do you consider it morally wrong?
If it's a murder, I consider it morally wrong. If there were, I mean, now look, if Stalin had been assassinated and that had led to some liberalization internal to the Soviet Union, then I think celebrations would have been entirely appropriate. And that's because they're celebrating the elimination of someone who was liable to be killed, whose elimination is going to be better for innocent people.
Mhm.
So it makes a lot of difference whether it's a justified assassination or a murder. If it's murder, the victim is not liable and the consequences are going to be bad, then it is wrong to celebrate.
Okay, it is morally wrong, but do you think that people who celebrate a murder should be deprived of work? I mean, that they should be fired, that is the a proportionate punishment for them?
No, I don't think that there should be any legal restriction on celebrating the death of anybody. Um, and I also think the private forms of punishment are generally also inappropriate. I mean, it all depends on the context. Suppose there's a small business, there are three people who run let's say, some sort of little market, and one of them is found to be celebrating publicly a murder.
Mhm.
That's going to be bad for the business. It's wrong to do that. In those circumstances, it might very well be right for the other owners of the business to expel the one who has behaved badly, for various reasons, both personal moral reasons and business reasons. But that's not what's going on in the cases now. What's going on now is just that businesses are afraid of the Trump administration. They're afraid of
Yeah.
bad publicity and so on, and they sacrifice people who, for the most part, haven't so much celebrated, but have just said, he was a bad person, Charlie Kirk. His views were iniquitous, and so on. Um, so again, it depends on whether you're just criticizing the person and criticizing the person's views, or saying how wonderful it is that he was killed. Those are completely different activities.
Mhm. Right. And I mean, generally speaking, because now we're getting also into the topic of free speech and what should be protected speech. I mean, generally speaking, do you think that there are any instances where people should be fired because of them expressing particular political opinions? I mean, I'm going to give you an example. A few months ago, Media Sun, the left-wing journalist and political commentator from the US, had a debate on a YouTube channel called Jubilee against 20 right-wing conservatives. I mean, some of them were even farther right than just a common right-wing conservative, because one of them expressed openly that he was a fascist and he didn't care about the US Constitution. And the person who expressed openly, admitted openly that he was a fascist after the debate, ended up getting fired. Uh, I mean, do you think that there should be limits to the sort of political opinions people can express publicly, and then getting punished in that way, of getting fired? Because I mean, I fall more on the left wing of the political spectrum, and I don't like fascists at all. But I don't agree that that person should have been fired.
Yeah, I agree with you. I can imagine special circumstances. So suppose this is someone who's part of a very small business, and I'm I'm somebody who works for this business, and I've always thought that this person was, a decent person. And then I learn this person says he's a fascist, or she, whatever, he's a fascist, and, has all these views that I think are really abhorrent. I might not want to work with this person. I might want some distance from this person. And if everybody else in the business is the same, then we might together decide we just don't want to be around this guy anymore. I can imagine that being justifiable, but by and large, I agree with you. Somebody holds abhorrent views, particularly in a big business where this person is just doing some job, and his views are not going to affect his effectiveness in the business or his relations with others in the business. So it's sort of pure publicity purposes to get rid of this person because of his views. Then I think that's wrong.
Yeah, I mean, I think exactly the same. I mean, I think that if a person's views does not affect directly their performance, the work they're doing, I mean, I don't think it's justifiable. Let me give you another example, and this is not a case of people having a particular kind of political view, but I think it was also funny in a way. So there's a far right party here in Portugal called Chega, and just over a week ago we had our municipal elections here, and people found out that one of the candidates they put forth in a particular municipality was a woman who had a OnlyFans account. So she was
Had what? Sorry?
creating an OnlyFans account. I mean, it is basically
I don't
a
know what that
site.
is.
Oh, okay, I'm going to explain. It's a website
Okay.
where women and men, wherever, can create adult content. So that's it. They can create
Okay.
pornography, things like that, and they can sell it there, or people can subscribe to their accounts, things like that. And there, there were people who were insinuating that because she had that account and she had that kind of activity, that we should question her competence to be part or to be part of a municipality, to be a politician. And I said, look, why? She has that kind of activity, but what kind of direct implications does that have for her work as a politician? As long as she's competent, as long as she knows what she's doing, why should we think she's less intelligent or less competent or less capable than, for example, a woman who's not a sex worker? So I mean, those are my thoughts. This is the way I think. I don't know if you agree or not.
Well, I mean, I don't think I entirely agree. I see your view. The one thing I would say is that if one should prefer to elect for to responsible governmental positions people who have good judgment. And in particular, if you're running for if you become a candidate for one of these things, and you maintain your own sort of pornography website or whatever it is, that's clearly not good judgment. And so that's evidence that this person lacks a certain kind of competence. So I do think it's relevant. If I found this out about a person, I mean, if the person otherwise had really good, strong, decent views about everything, I agreed enthusiastically with everything she said about local government, about international affairs, about politics, about morality, and so on. But there was this one instance of what I would consider poor judgment and questionable behavior, I would still go ahead and vote for her. But I do think it's a sort of mark against a candidate that the candidate would behave in this way, and in particular, while being a candidate for political office.
Okay, so just to understand your position a little bit better, in that particular case, do you think it's poor judgment to be a sex worker? Why specifically? Because you think that's a sort of immoral activity, or is it for another reason?
Uh, I honestly don't know what I think about sex workers. As I understood what you were saying initially, I didn't understand that this woman was a sex worker. I thought she and a man had some kind of website where they sold or distributed videos of them having sex or something like that.
No, I mean, it's an individual thing. It's individual women who can create accounts on that website and then sell their I mean, explicit content wherever it might be. So
Okay, well, that's not well, is that I don't really know what the definition of a sex worker is. So she could have all this explicit content without actually having sex with anybody? So she
yes,
wouldn't
yes.
physically. Well, even so, I do think that's it's yeah, I think it's an unseemly way to earn money. It's you know to sell erotic videos of yourself. I mean, I this is something I just don't have a view
Okay.
about. And sex workers in general, I just don't know.
Okay.
It's not something I've thought about.
Okay,
Sorry.
that's fair enough. That's fair enough. So let me just ask you then one last question. And since we were just talking about free speech, do you think that if there are instances where political violence might be justified, do you think that calling for political violence should be protected speech?
Um, I assume that by protected speech, you mean that there should be no legal constraints on this. And
Mm.
uh, I'm inclined to think that there should be some legal constraints on um, speech advocating political violence.
Mm.
And that's not because I think advocacy of political violence is always wrong. It
Okay.
is that in order to try to constrain advocacy for morally unjustified political violence, and as I have said before, I think most political violence is morally unjustified. It either targets people who are not liable to be harmed, or it's going to be self-defeating if it does target people who are genuine wrongdoers. So political
Yeah.
violence is very unlikely to be justified. So it's wise and likely to have the best consequences for society for there to be legal constraints on the advocacy of political violence.
Yeah.
Though there are instances in which the advocacy of political violence could be morally justified and possibly even morally required. Sometimes we are morally required to break the law and to break a justified law.
Yeah. Okay, so let's perhaps wrap up our conversation here. I think we've already went through the most relevant aspects that I wanted to explore here. So, Jeff, apart from your books, which we've already explored, I mean, at least some of them on the show, are there any places on the internet where people can find your work?
Yeah, the people could find papers that I've published on my University of Oxford webpage, though it hasn't been updated in about 4 or 5 years, so a lot of my recent publications aren't there. There's also a website called academia.edu, and you just type that in, academia.edu, and you put in my name, and a lot of my articles and so on are posted there.
Great. So thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show again. It's always a great pleasure to talk with you.
Well, thanks, Ricardo. Again, as I've said before, your show is just magnificent. You must be the most learned person in the world, because you have to read books by all the people you interview and so on. I mean, you must know infinitely more than I do. It's a remarkable show.
Thank you. Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, learning and development done differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Ergo Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Mikkel Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Forte, Tiago Nunes, Fergal Cossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Labyrinth, João Linhares, Stantantia, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardus France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Dana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Alman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeager, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Lowacki, Georgios Theophanos, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry D. Lee Jr., Old Erringbon, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Zigoren, Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismail Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Dios Necht. A special thanks to my producers: Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Ugni, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Giancarlo Montenegro, Alni Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, Bogdan Kanivets, and Rosie. Thank you for all.